Sahana Bhavatu Sahanau Punuktu Saha Viryam Karavavahai Tejasvinavaditam Mastu Mavidvishavai. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. May that one protect us all together, may he nourish us both together, may we work conjointly with great energy. May our study be vigorous and effective. May we not mutually dispute or cavil with each other. And peace, peace, peace be unto all. Om Vasudeva Sutam Devam Kamsa Chanuramardanam Devaki Paramanandam Krishnam Vande Jagadgurum. We salute Krishna, son of Vasudeva, destroyer of Kamsa, Chanura, lust, greed, passions, supreme delight of Devaki, God himself, Guru of this universe. But before we launch into continuation of 8th chapter, Bhagavad Gita, whose theme has been advertised as death and dying, we can take some questions. No questions, of course, there are no answers.
If we haven't reached enlightenment, should we fear death?
If we have not reached enlightenment, should we fear death? The highest conclusion in Vedanta is a state of abhaya, fearlessness. Not only should we not fear death, we should fear nothing. Since the highest conclusion tells us that only one entity exists. So how do we approach this entity? We've discovered in the various chapters that what is presented as our world meaning where the attention goes toward certain objects related to 5 senses only, and then reacting in 5 different ways, 5 organs of reaction. The external world and the external objects, where of course all our energy and all our thought is normally directed to obtain those in a purpose. These all, of course, are various forms of death. This is how the Brihadaranyaka Upanishad describes it. But these various perishable parts, 16 perishable parts being there, 5 objects, 5 organs of action, 5 organs of information, inputs, and the mind, 16 in all, are all perishable parts. And the whole idea of this Bhagavad Gita, 8th chapter, is Akshara Brahma Yoga, the yoga of the imperishable Brahman. And as we mentioned last week, when we talk about this world, so-called, that is the world of our immediate experience, we immediately understand it is to do with perishable parts. In contrast to that, Brahman has no perishable parts. But when we discover that entity, we find it is all one thing. Just as we understand that when we climb a building, around Krishna's language, we go up through the steps and so on, get to the roof, we understand, roof, steps, everything is only the one entity. From our point of view, how is it that we fear, is a good question, in the face of what we know as logical and empirical philosophy. And so the question, should we fear death if our life has not resulted in this particular goal of freedom? But what is there to fear when you fill up with God? After all, from the 7th chapter onwards, the approach is from the human understanding of the heart. That is, where a soul or a jiva or an individual entity, a lover of God, taps into the honey of the Supreme Principle, on behalf of which Krishna is acting. Krishna is acting as the Supreme Purusha, Supreme Entity. And Arjuna, like all of us, is acting as the devotee. A kind of principle that learns to direct all our energetic efforts in a loving way toward a supremely loving entity that religion calls God. With that in mind, characteristics of that God come out. Every image, for example, in Hinduism, gives us an assurance. Many of the images within Christianity give us the same assurance by virtue of a blessing hand. There's nothing to fear. If God is our father, our mother, our all in all, our friend, our lover, our companion, our nearest and dearest, closer than breathing, then what is there to fear? Fear only comes in when there is a diversity of understanding, when we put ourselves in a certain position and where all our consciousness flows outward. This is a diversion away from our purpose. It's interesting that many saints, you find Swami Shivananda, direct disciple of Ramakrishna, was one of them, who toward the end of life required diversions. Otherwise, what use would he be? His mind would soar off to the highest. To keep his mind down, as it were, he decided that he would have all kinds of bric-a-brac and diversionary things around his bed. His attendant asked, "Why, Maharaj, why do you have all these insignificant, trivial things?" And his answer was tantamount, "I have to keep my mind down." So we have to understand that normally when the mind is naturally diversified and diverted, then this gives us fear, temptation, doubt, pain. Where there is no second, there is no pain, no fear. What second is there to fear, says the Upanishads? There's nothing else to fear. That's the thing. I always recall a miscommunication in a church bulletin. Don't allow yourself to be distressed. Let the church help you. That's along with a whole series of interesting church bulletin notices, such as the fasting and penance conference. Food will be provided. So this is a very relevant question because I labeled this particular section of the Bhagavad Gita as a subject of death and dying. Death is something that we all know will happen. But how do we die? And all of us, you can think of it this way, all of us are heading for the graveyard. It's just we don't want to think of it in this way. We want to preserve our life as closely as possible. And the final thing that we want to do is cling to life, and we cling to it desperately, and we cling to it with great, great vigor, thinking that it'll happen to everybody else, but not ourselves. But I happen to know of a beautiful, beautiful scene that I came across only a few days ago. There was a devotee in Zimbabwe contacted me and said, you see, and I knew his wife had been ill for a long time, suffering from various complications associated probably with diabetes. And it seemed that the doctors had no solution, and it seems that the tests they did had shown some positivity. So it gave him some hope. Now he's a person of tremendous philosophical bent, the husband that is, of the dying, of the wife who had all these sufferings. And so death and dying was nothing to him. He had experienced death and dying in his family before, his father, his mother, and so on, and his sister. But now it came to his wife. He was shocked and surprised at a moment when she died, and she died probably 2 days back. But the way he described it was so beautiful. In the night, she called out in the Shona language, the native language of Zimbabwe, oh God, accept me, accept me, accept me. Please come to me and accept me." Like that. Chanting that constantly. It woke him up. He dashed to the bedside. "Are you all right? Are you all right?" And she said, "Well, actually, you need to call the ambulance. I am dying." He called the ambulance, of course. By the time the ambulance came, they tried to revive her. She was gone. Naturally, he's distraught because as humans, that's what our reaction is. After all, they'd been married for 45, 46, 47 years, possibly. I don't know, that sort of region. But even this sound philosophy of ours, even this idea that things are born, they live and they die, even this understanding that there is only one entity seeming to look like all these perishable parts, and that when we go into a dreamless sleep, all these perishable parts disappear and we experience a sleep. In other words, a dress rehearsal for death every night. We vacate our personality. We may have a kind of adventure, a mixture of memory and sleep mixed together called dream. And ultimately a sleep where if an external person measures some brain waves, they are very, very calm, even kind of type. And we reincarnate, as it were, the following morning and enter into our waking life, but it's only a phase of consciousness that we deem to be real and evaluate everything from that particular point of view. One unique thing about the Bhagavad Gita, in contrast to the Upanishads, is that the Upanishads all mention in various places from time to time this idea of these three states of consciousness. The Bhagavad Gita does not put this. And so we have to go into the Upanishads to find out this final understanding of this non-dual position. And after all, this Advaita, this non-dual position, we unashamedly preach, because this is the religion, according to Swami Vivekananda, that will be the salvation of the world, and we should actively teach this non-dualism everywhere. But can we teach it all in one go? No. We have to go through these steps, which we call these perishable parts, go into more and more subtle areas. After all, the perishable parts that we're describing, 16 perishable parts, are backed by something much more subtle. These subtle elements of tanmatras, these rudimentary forces, are waves that underlie everything. And we are all basically thinkers, and thoughts act as waves. And these waves ultimately combine, and because they are derived from a cosmic mind, that cosmic mind that mythology calls Brahma, and that we might call the creator, or the cosmic balancing power, or cosmic mind, or cosmic Christ, or cosmic Buddha, or cosmic Krishna. All of these enter into the central point, this cosmic mind from which all of these come. And when we take a devolutionary journey back to that, there we find, Lord, you are there, Lord of the universe, resplendent with many characteristics. The Bhagavad Gita supplies us very beautifully 8 of these characteristics, and we can easily meditate on these. Why should we meditate on these? Because the art of dying requires us to learn the art of living. And by the art of living, I mean the art of reviewing all the things that are going through the mind as these impulses of thought, understanding that every experience has 2 discernible parts, as it were, positions. One is the perceiver and the other perceived. And by going through this and continuously understanding which is the perceiver, which is the perceived, we come to an understanding. By this kind of discipline, by this spiritual practice, constantly done, constantly meditate on the divine, we come to a point where at the last moment, bearing in mind, as I mentioned last week, every second is the last moment. We can't say that the last moment of our breath is the last moment. The last moment of our waking state is the last moment of our waking world. And the last thought of our waking world is the first thought when we introduce it again. It has to be like that. The pattern of the whole life that we are used to and accustomed to, is a cyclical model. It's not a linear model. Even though we think in linear moments, we think we are here and next we are there, and we had a past and we'll have a future, and in that future it'll come to a termination point that we call death. But understand that dying, the body is no stranger to it. Every 7 years, every single cell of the body has died and been reincarnated, replaced. How can we doubt such a thing? How can we doubt a principle of so-called reincarnation when we find it in the body constantly? And yet the same person is there. A sense of the perceiver is there, in amongst the perceived. With all of this in mind, we have nothing to be fearful about. Even though, of course, every effort should be made to get the freedom in this life. This 8th chapter will deal with this in great detail. But every experience is a learning experience. And for physical reasons, because the instrument breaks down. We are equipped, of course, with 2 wonderful instruments. Let's, for convenience sake, describe them as external and internal. The external, we've described, has all these perishable parts, and comes, of course, in order to perceive these external objects which are no different from them. And then, of course, we have the internal instrumentation of mind, consisting of ego, mind, intellect, etc. This internal instrument is capable of being refined and purified. And it is that purification process that we call spiritual practice. And this leads us to this goal of immortality. This afternoon, we attended a wonderful memorial service, as I mentioned before we started, for those who perished in World War I. What a horrendous thing that was. And you imagine all the soldiers going in, I think some 4 million people perished, going into that situation. And after some time, knowing, you might have gone in with a spirit of adventure, but after a while you know that you're lucky to be alive from moment to moment and day to day, because the person that you were having a joke with next door to you, his body is lying next door to you also, lying in the mud. And some of those bodies were just trenches. Some of the graveyards actually were just trenches filled in. Too many were the bodies. And if you go to Flanders, you go to Belgium, and you see all the killing fields really, that in its day was just churned up mud and dismal rainy conditions and just land churned up by merciless artillery bombardment. What a desperate thing. It must have looked like hell. And so death would have been just that entity right next door to you. But see the courage with which those young men fought. On both sides. It was as horrendous for both of them. Just a deviation a little bit to show the beauty of the human spirit. 1914, but by December, everybody thought and was told on both sides, this war, this great war, will be over by Christmas. And what happened was, Christmas Eve, the Allies were in their trench, Germans in their trench, and the Allies heard Germans singing of Christmas carols, Silent Night. Silent Night is a German song, essentially. In German they heard it drifting. They saw in the other trench candles, some merriment, and they thought, well, of course it's Christmas. Each got out of the trench and met each other in so-called no man's land. They played football. They exchanged gifts, and much to the displeasure of the officers. But some of the officers took part. But when I say officers, those operating the chess pieces on the battlefield. That you see, if we can carry on like this, there'll be no war. We have to have a war. All our governments demand it. Our political positions demand it. The whole of Europe demands it because certain alliances have to be kept in place. All power and greed, resulting in the most horrendous death. The Second World War had more victims than the first, but not as much horror, because for the first time chemical warfare was used. Mustard gas, a strange thing floating across. All the chivalry associated with war was gone completely, and it was man's inhumanity to man. What's the purpose of me telling all of this? Well, firstly, because this memorial is fresh in my mind. Second, we should never wish for this again. And certain Western authors understood on the back of this First World War, and then not so far afterwards, the Second World War, we should never do this again. Man is so much better than that. But look at the waste of life, look at the waste of opportunity. And so, this is a moment where this tremendous philosophy of the divinity of man has a capacity to rescue the whole of humanity beyond mere kindness and compassion, and go to a much deeper level of worship and adoration, where we see the entire Lord of the universe there, beyond death. So death is something we should not fear. And even, you see, in the previous chapters of the Bhagavad Gita, it's clearly laid out. And nothing you should fear. Supposing you don't achieve this freedom in this life, then you have unlimited opportunities to pass your university exam. This is the wonderful, wonderful, enlightening, encouraging message. But it's up to us how much we want to waste it. So before us is a question: what is the ideal model in terms of dying? Since it will happen to all of us, have we cultivated the art of dying? Is it something we look forward to? Is it something we accept? And in the last moment, how will we conduct ourselves? Now, the way in which we'll conduct ourselves is the way we have always conducted ourselves. That's the most important lesson. You can't just rescue yourself at the last moment. It's the unconscious mind, the habit level, that will win through. How did you mold that? How did you cultivate that? So when we talk of spiritual practice, we're talking of constant practice. This is described from last week as abhyasa. See, abhyasa yoga. So it's worth recapping. See, that Sri Ramakrishna gives a comment, going back then to the 7th stanza. He says, "The singing mendicant on the street artfully plays on the stringed instrument with one hand, and with the other gracefully beats the drum fastened around his neck. These two items of music serve as accompaniment to his songs. In this way, in this manner, man ought to discharge his worldly duties carefully, and at the same time, be inclined Godward. He should imbibe godly tendencies more and more, progressively. Progressively. No panic. Don't try and do it all of a sudden. For most people, it works step by step, progressing through these perishable paths until we get, there you are, Lord. Then go back. A balancing act, doing your duty, doing your day-to-day activities like anybody else, except this one thing, without anxiety. Without anxiety. Let everybody else do the same actions. They may do it with anxiety, since they feel that they have to be either in a defensive or attacking or yielding position. They feel that they have to take charge of their body and mind in the face of an enemy. That is the world in general. A struggle for survival. Well, if you're struggling for survival, what difference is there between you and any other crude animal? Study any biological form of animal life, be it insect life, even be it bacterial life. Bacteria have a way of swimming. They use a thing called the flagellum, a very controversial mechanism. Controversial because Darwinian evolutionists have had to defend the idea from people like a man called Behe, who is a biologist, academic biologist, and he has coined a term called irreducible complexity. And he used this flagellum as an example, because when you study it and study its past, you'll see this is a wonderful mechanism of engineering. What you'll find is a rotor, what you'll find is a shaft, as if it were engineered. And the conclusion is, if it looks as if it's designed, neo-Darwinian atheists who defend Darwinian ideas to the hilt, and coincidentally would be atheistic, will tell you, it looks as if it's designed, it seems to be designed. Well, then why not go a step further? It is designed, Basuri. Why not say it's designed? No, that's a step too far. I have a paradigm that doesn't accept that. So on the other side of the argument, you may have this, how jokes come in this variety. How many people does it take to change a light bulb? So how many evolutionists does it take to change a light bulb? None. You just wait around long enough until it changes itself. Well, that doesn't seem very tenable or feasible. See? So you can say by capital C by chance, a position of randomness, you can say that. Or you can say perhaps this came from an omniscient mind, some entity that expresses itself. Now we won't say it's designed, except as a step in understanding. But our final conclusion would be, it looks, we come back to the original idea, it looks as if it's designed. We go full circle and say, yes, it seems to be designed. But not necessarily in the way you think, not necessarily a dualistic position where some entity sits aloof and constructs a world ex nihilo from nothing and engineers something. No, we bypass so many problems to do with this by simply saying, what seems to be the world, we still use the word seem, what seems to be the world is nothing more than that single entity using this apparitional mechanism of causation. And that entity itself has become the world. Thou art the taste in water. See? Thou art the brilliance in the sun. Already in the 7th chapter we've covered some of those descriptions.
Swami, can I ask, why would we give emotions then if it's unhelpful to feel anxious and fearful?
Yes. No, it's not necessarily unhelpful. What is helpful is the first chapter of the Bhagavad Gita that says Arjun is emotionally unhappy. It's taken as a yoga, a method, an approach. It's taken as the most fundamental approach. So if you are despondent, depressed, and close to a psychological aberration or difficulty, blessed are you. This is the first step. And what is the next step? Gain in confidence. On what basis? On the basis that fundamentally all your problems arise from an identification with a psychophysical field, body-mind. Whereas your identification really should be the immortal self. Did that immortal self give you emotion? No. The immortal self is immortal. It cannot give, it cannot take. If it gave and took, then we'd have to abandon that idea. But does it play that role, the manifested role of a creator? Yes. Is that our final conclusion? No. So when we answer these questions, we have to look at it from a much deeper avenue or a broader avenue. We have to say, Yes. Yes to everything, but not draw the line there. Materialist, this world is all that exists. Our reply, it seems to be like that, but there's more. The idealist says, it seems that there's only mind. Idealism. It seems to be like that, but there's more. The solipsist says, it seems that there's only one mind, a cosmic mind. It seems to be like that, but there's more. The theologian says there's a creator God, and God is eternally separate from his universe. We say it seems to be like that. We accept it, but there's more. Everywhere you look, there's more, until you come to a final dot, a final conclusion. There cannot be more. Why? Because a totality is there. And how do you describe such a thing? Beyond words, beyond concepts. There, the mind comes back together with the senses. So when we ask these questions and answer them, we have to be broad enough and have enough skill and enough adventure and sporting attitude to be able to shift our position. And this is why Vedanta is the supreme toolbox. So why does God give us emotion? Why not? After all, is God not love? Should we therefore not love? Is there a reason for that? If God is all of this, will we not find the evidence in this world? There are these three dimensions within us. We have the head, the hand, and the heart. So we've been through this. See, on the second part of the Enneagram, we covered this, that there are these three aspects, and people have a propensity toward one or the other. Three aspects of the mind. And we require all of them. Why? Because this love is reflected in relational humans. It reflected in the relational mind. Why should there be a relational mind? Because when we elevate it to a supreme status, to its most pristine and undiluted and most pure form, we find pure love. Polluted or seemingly polluted by selfishness and so on. So what we find as an energy called anger is really just the same energy as love, misdirected or directed in a more self-centered way. Even human life directed in a self-centered way. What we call human love is actually love of yourself. Why do you love this entity? You can use either a human or an object. And we somehow mix this word up. I've covered this before. We have this one word for a number of different things. In other languages it's separate. But in English we find, I love you and I love chocolates. And sometimes I can't decide which I love more. You see? When I feel that I require some psychological compensation, some inner nurturing, since nobody else will do it, let me do it myself, then I might go on a private chocolate trail and say, oh, I love chocolates more than anything in the world, more than any human, and definitely more than a psychiatrist. The alternative is I have to go to a psychiatrist and say, I'm very unhappy. Please tell me what to do, but I have to pay some money for that. And what does the psychiatrist do? Puts me on the proverbial couch and takes the notebook out and says, my dear friend, please tell me what a fool you are. And you better tell them. But as you're saying, of course, the psychologist still keeps charging. See? Until the appointment's over, next session. Please come back. String it along until it comes back. Now, I'm not knocking the profession at all, of course, but I'm knocking a system. A system that says that we pull away from some kind of formula or contentment, replacing it with a formula of our own that doesn't work, which is essentially egocentric, not really dealing with the issue properly. When we deal with the issue properly, that is, not directly, not head-on, but round the side, like dealing with any animal, making friends with a horse or a dog. Don't stare it in the eyes. If you want to make friends with a dog, don't have a staring competition with the dog. It'll tear you to pieces. It'll take it for aggression. Look here, put your hand out there, let it sniff a little bit, Then allow the fingers to go to the ear, stroke a little bit, then pat a little bit, and so on and so forth. Now you're friends. Now you can comfortably look at each other. Even the dog will look at you sideways. See? It's a sign of submission. Those who read dog body language will tell you it's a sign of submission. See? Just as the tail when it wags, then you have a friend. Humans are different because they don't have tails. We have no idea when we're friends with them. They might just suddenly attack you, unreliable. Dogs are very reliable. You can exactly interpret their body language. Of course, humans are also the same. So we deal with it indirectly in this way, that by loving God intensely, making that your supreme practice for this modern age, we don't have to attend to anything else. Like conquering your shadow, I may have told you last week or some other weeks, how will you do it? You can give it a lecture, it won't work. You can surprise it, suddenly turn around and stab it. No, you won't conquer it like that. And you can hide from it, but you'll find it's there with you. It's an impossible thing. And shadow, of course, is psychology speak for this deep mental aberration, this great thing that we are avoiding, this hidden entity, this psychological baggage, which we've described in Sankhya language as samskaras, negative samskara. Some habit that is dark, some formula you decided to use, along the basis of biological impulses, it does not work. Some other formula has to be acquired. So, look to the face of God, fullness and freedom, the face of radiance and omniscience, and the shadow will fall behind, just as when you face the sun and walk, the shadow obediently follows, nothing to be given up. When you start loving something, your previous love for something falls off by itself. No formal, direct renunciation necessary. That's the beauty of this bhakti yoga system. So a beautiful description is there. And the last eighth stanza, with the mind not wandering after anything else, just to remind you, made steadfast in the yoga of constant practice, this abhyasa yoga. He who meditates, that is, always keeps on mind, in mind, meditates on the Supreme, resplendent Purusha reaches him. And this we went through last week. Not only is it supreme, but it is resplendent. And this is now leading into a wonderful meditative description. What is that? So, how does this yogi relinquish the body? And normally we take these two stanzas here in one go, because they are so related. One is an extension of the other. So we deal with 9 and 10 together. Kavim Puranam Anushashitaram Ano Aniyam Sam Anusmarayat Yaha Sarvasya Dataram Achintya Rupam Aditya Varnam Tamasaha Parashtat Praya Nakale Manasa Chalenam Bhaktya Yukto Yoga Bharina Chaiva Purva Madhye Pranam Avesha Samyak Satam Param Purusham Upaiti Divyam. The first word of this is beautiful, beautiful word. Kavim. You may have heard Kavi is like a poet. And here it means some poetic expression that is full of knowledge, omniscient, we can say. The whole thing, and then we'll break these concepts up. The omniscient is described. 8 things are described. The ancient, the ruler, minuter or more subtle than an atom. supporter of all, of form inconceivable, effulgent like the sun, beyond all darkness. He who meditates on this resplendent, the clue was in the last stanza, Supreme Purusha at the time of the death, with a steady mind, devotion and strength of yoga, concentration, well fixing the entire energy, called prana, in the middle of the eyebrows, he reaches him. That is summoning all your attention and aligning your personal will with the Supreme Will, is the purport of it. Omniscient. This, you see, there are so many passages in every religion that tells of the glories of God. In Hinduism, we have the Lalita Sahasranam, 1,000 names. Every entity will have at least 1,000 names. You are this, you are that. Beautiful, because the more we look at it, the more adoration we get, the more thankfulness we get, the more wonder we have. And we develop this love. So this omniscient, this Kavim, omniscient, and Puranam, ancient. This omniscient means it's like the sun who radiates everywhere and therefore knows every corner. An enduring entity, way above everything else, that naturally knows everything else. We have no example like that in human life of omniscience. Of course, we think we know something, but as soon as we know something, the inference is there's something outside that border, that boundary, that we don't know. But this is an omni thing, that is all-knowing. Everything is fully, consciously emanating in a divine radiance. Full consciousness is there. What a wonderful thing. Now if you ask, how is it that the human has an intellect? Not just the human, but how is it that every creature has a level at least of intelligence, depending on its structure, its instrumentation. Human instrumentation is such that the full expression of this intellect is present. Is it not because there is an omniscient entity? How is it that we have a wish to exist if it's not because there is an omnipresent entity behind? Fully existent, existence itself, consciousness itself. Consciousness itself expresses itself as the capacity to reason and think. Omnipresence gives us the capacity, or pure existence gives us the capacity to feel we should survive, never to deny our existence. One thing everybody agrees on, I exist. I have discussed things with all kinds of atheists. Well, the last discussion, disaster, unfortunately, is still around at the university. And I brought the subject up. I said, surely you take at least this for granted, that you exist. And the person impulsively said, no, not necessarily. Well, then, of course, if we're having a non-existent conversation in a non-existent hall, then let's, let us, our non-existence part our non-existent ways. No point in continuing. Of course, everybody agrees, I exist. It's a good starting point. See, cogito ergo sum. This was the famous kind of statement, see, from Descartes, that famous philosopher. He says, I think, therefore I am. As an understanding of self-awareness, self-reference, surely that means not only am I a conscious entity, but I know I am existence. In two things you've gotten the description overall of existence, consciousness. What about the third one? Bliss. So omniscient, the ancient, we can understand some ancient things. As you get older, you'll become more ancient, of course, and you'll see how other ancient things were. We can look historically, look at this Flanders field. The generation today will be so far removed from that World War I. They won't really understand it, except maybe through documentaries and so on. They'll be much more interested in more modern things, modern conflicts. is part of history. So to them, those who took part in that are ancient. I don't think there are any survivors today of that era. I think the last one died maybe last year or something like that. Probably 100 and something. Maybe some are still around, but they'd be over a century old. See? But it doesn't matter how far you go back in history. There's some entity that's already standing there. So this entity is Puranam, most ancient. That means the original entity. You can't have more ancient than the original entity that stood there. Before the world spun itself into a ball, before the solar system was arranged, before hydrogen and helium fell through the capacity of gravity to squeeze them into something, and the explosion of supernova, making all the various elements from carbon onwards. All of that occurred in very ancient times. Modern cosmology will put a time frame on it, thinking that there's a beginning, something that is very highly debatable, thinking there's a beginning and calculating 13.8 billion years. 13.8 billion years, yeah. How is that calculated? It's calculated by creating a minimum thing, because we know that some stars are 13.1 billion years, and it has to be older than that. And then you make some fudging here and there, and you get to this, and it may change. So anyway, there's a range. You can't have a situation where the beginning of the universe is younger than stars. So therefore, you have to make some adjustments. Anyway, be that as it may, very ancient. We don't know how ancient, except we know this, that our understanding of time and antiquity is only our human understanding. And we cannot understand or even comprehend infinity. Something that is infinite. When we look at even the observable universe, the mind cannot comprehend its vastness. And then it comes down to, there's a ruler. So, this wonderful statement, Anushasitaram, it's a ruler, an entity that governs. The universe is not haphazard. It's a marvel in modern science that we have all of these constants so finely balanced. The word is finely tuned, an anthropic principle somehow, where things are exactly right. And if you ask how biological life developed, nobody will answer, unless you give that electric light bulb changing answer. If we wait around long enough, it'll change itself. So there is a ruler that ordains everything and governs everything, and we find this internally expressed. Bhagavad Gita itself will internally express it as the ruler of a 9-gated city, and Katha Upanishad will tell us that it is unchanging or unwavering, uncrooked and unborn. Some kind of emperor or empress, we can imagine it like that, sitting within a city of 9 gates. And the reference here is that when a person is dying, you can use a number of gates, but if you want to use the royal entrance, this is reserved for these great yogis who withdraw their life energy and leave gracefully through the royal entrance. What a beautiful idea. And then, subtler than the atom. We have no idea the size of an atom today. We have an idea of the very lowest value called Planck. Planck scale is how it's kind of measured, which is infinitely small, unable to be seen. And when we have a description of an electron which says it is an excitation in Hilbert space, we have no idea what that means. It means we just don't know. We can't trace it. We can trace the effects, no doubt, but so subtle. And the most subtle of all would be quantum fields. Some area where things just appear and disappear almost randomly.
Swamiji, I was watching a program about 2 weeks ago, and it recounted how, you know, the Sahara Desert, there's
Not personally.
sandstorms, and sand is whirled up into the air, and it's transported 7,000 miles across the Atlantic Ocean and 27 million tons of it, and deposited in the Amazon rainforest because it's needed there to support the biosphere. I just couldn't believe it. You know, who does that?
Comes to Europe. The last week we
But
had the Sahara
that's
Desert.
true. It was on my card.
So we can see how it's
But this is every year.
it's very easy to see examples like that, and also to see the remarkable mechanism in cells, and see the remarkable adaptation of behavior, and to see somehow in this evolutionary drama that is this unfolding thing that we call nature. Nature itself must be involved. You can't say nature is an inert thing. You see, in the Brahma Sutras you have these various counter-arguments toward certain philosophical positions. According to the Sankhyas, nature itself can do everything. This is very much the same as materialist arguments today. You say, but then, counter-question, how do you get something that is so keenly intelligent from something that is inert, like a rock? And when you see not only the rock, but the whole planet is a living, dynamic organism, you have to come to that conclusion ultimately. And to miss that would be to miss the beauty of it, and the fine arrangement that you've just described, how well balanced everything is. Is it randomly like that, or is there some kind of purposefulness in this? So by saying ruler, we're inserting purpose. There's a purpose, there's an order, there's a rhythm, there's a direction, which is easily observable. And that's the difficulty. That's the dilemma today. How is it that it's arrived in this way? And so, subtler than the atom, ruler and subtler than the atom. And if something is subtler than the atom, then can we see it? Can we observe it? Can we comprehend it fully? Can we know it fully in a normal, objective way? Can the seer ever be seen? You can put it in that way, philosophical way. But even in terms of making it an object, because that's what the expectation is. If God exists, then please give us some evidence. This is the latest, materialist, atheistic materialist position. Give us evidence. What kind of evidence? Do you think God can be put into a test tube and see whether it's acid or alkaline? I always laugh, going way, way back, you see, to the 1960s or so, 1950s probably, where Yuri Gagarin, the first Russian cosmonaut, was put up into space, and he came down at that time. Khrushchev was in charge of the Soviet Union, and he says, in all seriousness, you see, there's definitely no God. Our communist atheism is correct, because our astronaut or cosmonaut went up there, he looked left, he looked right, and he never saw anything. What a funny idea. So, supporter of all, not only creating the rhythm of it, not only in its most subtle aspect, but also as support. Just as the earth is our support, just as the earth and this combination of elements goes to supply us with food. What a drama it makes. So supporter of all. Surely we should meditate on this and say, Lord, you are our support. How will we doubt? Then how will we fear? You are supporting. Nothing to doubt, nothing to fear. Everything to feel, I can be held. We can extend it in our imagination. I can be nurtured, I can be held, I can be carried. All responsibilities are yours. It gives me an opportunity for faith. Without that faith, a lack of faith means I have to struggle. This is compared in several ways to the approach of the monkey and the approach of the kitten. The kitten has a very unanxious life, very least stress. It just sits down, mews a little bit. Mother picks it up by the scruff of the neck and moves it wherever, and the kitten just allows itself to be carried. In contrast to that, the monkey approach is to cling on desperately to a reeling, jumping monkey and hold on desperately lest you get thrown off through centrifugal force into the depths of a forest. Of form inconceivable. Every form is his form. And there in the 11th chapter we find this idea of 1,000 eyes, 1,000 hands, 1,000 heads. Such a cosmic entity placed everywhere, the entire universe, and more. If you disagree on a theological basis, no, God doesn't look like this, looks like this, then we have the chameleon problem. Sri Ramakrishna's story of the people who lived under a tree and saw a peculiar animal and got into a debating society about it. No, it's yellow, no, it's green, no, it's purple. And then going to a person who has seen this animal every day and asks, please tell me conclusively, what color is this animal? Oh, that's called a chameleon. Sometimes it's brown, sometimes it's green, sometimes it's yellow. You're all correct. And sometimes it has no color at all, formless. Effulgent like the sun. It is very often that we have to think of God in these terms of radiance, life-giving. It's effulgent. That means it doesn't require a second entity to light it. It's self-lighting and beaming like the sun, giving all these attributes of beauty, this evidence of beauty and life. We don't have to go far to see beauty when we look at a sunrise or a sunset. Most people in Ireland either are or wish to be sun worshippers. Sometimes to their benefit, sometimes to their detriment. They go off to Spain, somewhere like that during the summer months, come back and curse Ireland because Ireland had a wonderful summer and they spent all that money going across there. And they all come back, you see, with different colored skins. And the comment, oh, you have a nice color, means you're suffering from sunburn. Effulgent like the sun, and beyond all darkness, beyond all ignorance, beyond all everything which is pessimistic, which is dark, which is negative. All these things which bring us down, beyond depression, beyond all of that. He who meditates on this resplendent supreme Purusha, Purusha means this entity, this person. It's a personal entity, not impersonal. Impersonal you can think of as well. But this entity, this real entity, Divyam, resplendent, they reach. What do they reach? They reach the supreme, resplendent Purusha at the time of death. With what's required is a steady mind, number one, devotion, number two, and strength in this practice, in this bringing, what practice? Abhyasa, bringing the mind back, continuously bringing the mind back. To what? To this entity that has all these qualities. Omniscient, ancient, ruler, subtle, supporter, inconceivable form, yet effulgent like the sun, beyond all darkness. What a wonderful theme to meditate on. If you meditate on like that, then fixing the entire energy that you have called prana, the thing that makes everything move, including the body and the mind, in the middle of the eyebrows, as it were, that is, with my will individually, aligned to the divine. Prana, or life energy of the ordinary person, leaves the body at death through all the various other apertures. You'll find in a dying person, you'll find it's withdrawn as warmth from one area, then another, then another, then another. My hands are cold, my feet are cold. But for this yogi of steady mind, who is always glorying, wallowing in this entity with all these beautiful qualities and features. So what happens to that person? It gets concentrated, this energy gets concentrated between the eyebrows in yogic language, the Ajna chakra, and exits then through the royal entrance, Brahmarandra, through the skull, becomes warm, and then leaves. This last event is also the outcome of the strength of yoga, but it requires strength. Strength is a primary quality. It requires strength to direct your attention constantly in this way. But it requires also a sense of adventure, a sporting, delightful attitude. So we'll leave off there, 9:05, just to give you the continuation for next week a little bit. That which the knowers of Veda call the imperishable, this is the title of this chapter, imperishable Brahman, and to in which enter the sannyasins, the self-controlled and freed from attachment, and desiring which they lead a life of self-control, discipline, continence, that we shall declare to you with brevity. So we pick this up in our next chapter, and this is a brief chapter, but we're going into these wonderful, wonderful concepts and directions in great detail. And so we leave it off till next week. Om Shanti, Shanti, Shanti. Peace, peace, peace be unto all.